For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Steve Weitzman. I'm a professor of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania and director of the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. And it's my pleasure to get to welcome you today as our series on Jews, race, and religion continues. We are grateful, as always, for the support of the partners that are involved in making this program possible. They include, first and foremost, the Center for Jewish Ethics at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, under the center being under the directorship of Mira Wasserman, who you will be meeting a little bit later in this program. And we're also grateful for the support of Penn's Campaign for Community out of our provost office, as well as the NSF Paideia program. We're really thankful to them for their partnership. Before I introduce our speaker today, a few announcements and updates about various things. If you've been attending the series in the past and you were here last week, you may recall that we ran into a little technical disruption as our guest speaker lost his internet connection for about 5 or 10 minutes. So Professor Dollinger, our speaker last week, has very kindly re-recorded that lecture. And so if you're interested in seeing the thing without interruption, we will be sending you a link that will link you to that lecture. And we're really thankful to him for redoing that on our behalf. A couple of weeks ago, we had a talk by Professor J. Cameron Carter that elicited a very strong response, some very positive, but also a lot of pushback from people. One of our viewers, Professor Shaul Magid of Dartmouth College, has written a response from the perspective of a Jewish studies professor. So we are going to send you a link to his response as well. And finally, just one more practical announcement, and that is that next week is Penn's spring break. So we are not going to be having one of these lectures next week. We will resume on Thursday, March 18th at our normal 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but not next week. But we really, really hope that you'll come back and join us. We have 5 more programs scheduled for after the break, and they are going to be very exciting. They include presentations by a scholar in Morocco. We have a husband-wife team of scholars talking about race and religion within the family, a leading scholar of African-American religious history from Princeton. And so it's really going to be a wonderful series of 5 talks following our spring break. So please come back after our break next week. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful guest this afternoon, Professor Sylvester Johnson. Professor Johnson is the founding director of the Virginia Tech Center for the Humanities and is a nationally recognized humanities scholar specializing in the study of technology, race, religion, and national security. He's also assistant vice provost for the humanities at Virginia Tech and executive director of the university's Tech for Humanity initiative, a position he assumed after serving on the faculty of Northwestern University for many years. Now, much of Professor Johnson's research is focused on the intersection of the humanities and technology. He's trying to understand the human condition and social institutions of power in an age of intelligent machines and other forms of technology. And that is very exciting research. But the reason he is here with us today is that he is also a leading scholar of African-American religious history. He's the author of The Myth of Ham in the 19th century American Christianity, which is a study of race and religious hatred that garnered the American Academy of Religion's Best First Book Award. And he's also the author of another major, very consequential work, African-American Religions from 1500 to 2000, which is a kind of a panoramic view of African-American religious history in the United States, part of a much broader story. I have to, just a little moment of a personal kind of plug here. I've had the honor of being Professor Johnson's colleague. We were taught together at Indiana University. We also have co-edited a volume together on the FBI and religion. Just show it to you really quickly. That was for me a wonderful experience and also an eye-opening one. It helped me to understand as a scholar the way in which the religious history of the United States has been impacted by race and vice versa. So it is a real personal pleasure for me, as well as an intellectual pleasure for me to be able to introduce to you Professor Johnson today. And I'm going to turn the virtual stage over to him now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. It is such a great pleasure to be invited to to speak with you. It's been a real honor for me to be able to work with you, Steve, over many years. I remember when I first arrived at Indiana University back in 2006, and you said, Sylvester, I'd love to work with you on a project. And I thought, well, this guy's is a very highly renowned scholar of biblical studies. He's probably never going to work with me. And then we followed up with your idea about collaborating, looking at the relationship between the FBI and religion. And for me, it was such an encouraging and important experience for me to be able to collaborate with you as a senior colleague and as a great friend, and also to learn so much from that project. I've gotten a lot of really positive feedback from people who've used that book to particularly understand some of the timely challenges that we're seeing around national security and the relationship with religion. And so thank you, Steve, for your friendship, for the real kindness you've shown to me, and also for this exciting opportunity to speak with you today. So I'm going to go through a few talking points here, and should take around 25, 30 minutes, and then we'll stop, and would love to hear questions and comments and have a conversation about some of this. So I'm going to share my screen. So Limpieza de Sangre and the Clash of Civilizations. So I want to start by noting a very important scholar whose work became very influential toward the end of the 20th century and early 21st. Samuel Huntington was a political scientist at Harvard who in 1993 published a seminal article in the Foreign Affairs entitled The Clash of Civilizations. And he stated as his thesis in that article that the future of conflict, political conflicts globally, would not be so much between nation states. He said nation states are going to remain important, but the real conflict is not going to happen so much between nation states, but between civilizations. And he defined what he meant by these civilizations. Now, I'm going to first say that Samuel Huntington never claimed to be talking about race. He claimed that he was talking about something else, and that something else was civilization, which he gives an example of in the quote that I have here that I'm going to read. But I'm going to try to show you that the way that he understands civilizations and culture is actually very much part of a longer history of racializing populations through many different ways. I think that if we particularly pay attention to the history of this juridical political system that emerged in medieval times, known as Limpieza de Sangre, purity of blood, we'll actually see how what Samuel Huntington was doing was very much a type of racializing concept of people and of these boundaries of societies and these conflicts. So he says here, this is a quote from that article that later became a very popular book. The culture of a village in southern Italy may be different from that of a village in northern Italy, but both will share in a common Italian culture that distinguishes them from German villages. And he continues, European communities in turn will share cultural features that distinguish them from Arab or Chinese communities. Arabs, Chinese, and Westerners, however, are not part of any broader cultural entity. Okay, that's very important for the argument I'm making, so keep that in mind. He continues, they constitute civilizations. A civilization is thus the highest cultural grouping of people and the broadest level of cultural identity people have, short of that which distinguishes humans from other species. Okay? So once you leave that level of civilization, you have to start comparing humans to the parakeet or the earthworm to find another level of differentiation. It is defined both by common objective elements such as language, history, religion, customs, institutions, and by the subjective self-identification of people. So when he wrote this in the 1990s, Huntington understood himself to be coming up with a very new, really fresh way of understanding politics, global conflicts, and human identity. When in fact, what he was doing is actually not novel. You can compare his concept of people and civilizations to a number of individuals, some of whom I'll talk about in these slides. Why is this important, and what do we learn possibly from considering the history of Limpieza de Sangre. So Limpieza de Sangre, first of all, is a Spanish term that is easily translated purity of blood. And in this conception of purity of blood, what we have is a very violent history of Christian societies, Christian dominated, Christian ruled polities that identify Jews and Muslims as people who they may have lived in these Muslim societies, in these Christian societies rather, but they could not actually belong. And Limpieza de Sangre was part of the Spanish Inquisition, which was a set of trials that required people to demonstrate that they were of pure faith, pure meaning specifically Christian faith. So the image that you see here is a scene of torture, where people would actually be forced through pain and agony to bring to the surface their truths, to tell their truth through torture. This is certainly an old tradition, but it's also one that survived into our own time. And there are lots of things going on in this image, but it certainly portrays the relationship between the idea of applying pain to people and getting to truth. And the truth here being who they were, what kind of people they were. So Jews were forced to give an account of their ancestry. Were they of Jewish descent? Was someone of purely Christian descent? Was someone of Muslim descent? And the idea is that those who could truly belong to this Christian realm and who could be true Christians had to be pure in blood, meaning they had to be of pure Christian stock. Now, one of the important points to understand here is that this blood is more of a sort of like constitution. So if you join the army, they may put you through boot camp to see what you're made of. They're not concerned with your blood type per se, but rather with your overall constitution. That was how purity of blood functioned. It was a very broad understanding of what made people who they are. And if you had converted to Christianity from Islam or Judaism, you were not pure of blood. You were not of pure Christian descent. So if we think of Christianity as being merely about beliefs, then we already should run into a problem here, because the actual history of Limpieza de Sangre is one among many powerful demonstrations of how Christianity functioned. Is certainly something that was more than what people believe. This system of Limpieza de Sangre occurred in a larger context. So here you have a slide showing in the 1500s to 1700s, the Ottoman Empire. These were Islamic ruled polities that comprised many different populations of people, including Christians, Jews, and Muslims. If you've ever wondered why Columbus, and the dark brown here, by the way, the dark brown represents these Islamic societies. These are Muslim-dominated, Muslim-ruled polities that contain many different peoples. If you're ever wondering why Columbus would have sailed all the way to the Americas trying to get to the East, is because Muslims did not allow Christians to sail through the Mediterranean. So you can see that Mediterranean Ocean, the boundaries are Muslim dominated. So Christians had to find another route. This larger context of Muslim dominated polities bred a strong desire over many centuries by Christians to create a way of, as they imagine it, taking back their lands, reclaiming Christian land. So to the left in this slide is a red circle that shows Iberia, modern day Spain and Portugal. This was the region that was initially reclaimed in what's called the Reconquista. This is a very important watershed moment in a larger history of Christian rulers treating Jews and Muslims as people who were not capable of belonging to a Christian society. There's lots of works that we can talk about that have studied these understandings of race in so-called medieval times. Geraldine Hang is one of these. She's actually giving a talk at Virginia Tech later today. But this moment of Reconquista is really significant, because for Christians, it marked for them a point in which they saw themselves as taking back lands that Muslims and Jews had no business occupying, that it should be not just controlled by Christians, but occupied by Christians. And it's during this period, especially when there's a sharp increase in the very violent attacks on Jews, the pogroms, and Muslims, new structures that policed their ability to participate in civic society, really constraining their ability, and intensifying the claims that they have lived in these lands but were a threat to it. This is also happening in a context where throughout the larger Atlantic world, there is an exchange of peoples who are operating through slavery, through expanded commercialism of various products, that is introducing this language of what came to be called fetishism or animism. And one example of those encounters and the kinds of claims, racial claims that got made is represented by Charles de Brosse, who in 1760 wrote a very influential text that was called Cult of the Fetish Gods, in which he claimed that fetishism was the original religion of Blacks. In the same way that Islam was supposed to be the result of a certain kind of nature that was comprehensive. It could include ancestry, but it was also about how people thought, whether they could be loyal, their intellectual faculties, their emotional sensibilities, in the same way that Jewishness was claimed by Christians to constitute those kinds of sensibilities. Again, your constitution, what are you made of? It would include things that we think of as being biological, but purity of blood was far, far more than just what we think of as biology. It was, could you be loyal to Christian rulers? Could you actually participate in a Christian society? If you were not a pure Christian constitution, your thoughts, your habits, your ethical moral inclinations, you could not be a trusted participant in this society. And so these same kind of claims got made about other peoples, including indigenous Africans and indigenous Americans. So this claim and set of theories about fetishism and animism is actually part of this larger history. We move forward a little bit. Georg Hegel is someone who exemplifies this style of thinking about race in terms of something that goes far beyond so-called blood and soul racism. It's not just bodies, it's actually the kind of very complicated understanding of the Constitution that's represented by the system of Limpieza de Sangre. And he is especially effective in promoting an understanding of racial subjectivity, of racial essence, by talking about civilization. So this is just one way that Samuel Hunting is not actually being very original. He's putting a new spin on a very old idea. Hegel says, for instance, in his Introduction to the Philosophy of History, that history is the process of pure spirit, which is mind, coming into its fullness. And he sees Christian societies, Christian civilizations, Christian people as actually being at the zenith of this process. He talks about lots of civilizations. He mentions, for example, the roles of Africans. And here's a quote from his effort to try to put Africans in their place as a racial type, that Africa, he says, is unhistorical, with no movement or development of its own. The development that he's talking about, keep in mind, is this development of spirit. Events in its northern region belong to the Asiatic and European worlds. So he explains away whatever examples anyone might want to use, pointing to Carthage or Egypt to show, well, there are things here that Europeans have taken and exemplified as civilization. He says that's not really part of Africa. Egypt has no part in the spirit of Africa. What we understand as Africa proper is that unhistorical and developed land, which is still enmeshed in the natural, is the term, spirit, okay? And which had to be mentioned before we cross through the threshold of world history itself. And then he begins to talk about other races. He talks about Oriental races, and he includes the so-called Semitic races in this. And he relegates them to a lower level of development of spirit, because Jews, Asiatics, Africans cannot, according to Hegel, embody this level of existential freedom that is part of this long process. So that's not about skin color, that's not about hair texture, that's not about the shape of one's nose or anything like that. He's literally talking about spirit, but it is very much a racial understanding of identity that is rooted in the kinds of claims and institutions and practices that we see with Limpieza de Sangre. You have a way of relegating people to an outside status that's not limited to or contingent purely on what many people today might think of as a biological notion of race. Another individual who was a major proponent of anti-Jewish racism, of anti-Semitism, was Ernest Renan, who is well known as a philologist, as literally the person who establishes philology as an intellectual disciplinary enterprise. The study of Sanskrit was actually very important for Renan. He called language a window into the soul of a race. Now, why did he say this? Because Renan argued that if you could understand the semantic structures of language, the vehicle that this became was one that took you to understanding how a race of people actually thought, how they understood the world, what their values were, how they conceived of reality. Again, he's not talking about skin color, he's not talking about hair texture, but he is very much promoting in his work an anti-Semitic understanding of subjectivity, of civilization, of racial supremacy. We have something today in linguistics, for example, that's categories of races, the categories of languages, rather, Hamitic languages, Semitic languages, and Indo-European languages. Renan was especially influential in shaping that notion of Indo-European. The Indo was the Sanskrit. The European, for him, was the connection for Christian Europeans to have with an ancient language, and this was very important for him, that was older than Hebrew, okay? He did not want a Jewish language to occupy this status as the world's oldest studied language. With the discovery by Europeans of Sanskrit texts, of Vedic scriptures, Sanskrit became a way of claiming not only was Hebrew not the oldest language, but that there was actually a more sophisticated language system that was a product of Indo-European peoples, that is Aryan peoples of the Aryan race. And because Sanskrit became, in Renan's work, the chief representation of Aryan linguistic purity and supremacy, it became a way of creating a linguistic supremacist ideology to promote anti-Semitism. Another individual who's part of this tradition was Ferdinand Bauer, who became a huge figure in the study of Christian text, biblical studies, biblical criticism. And he promoted something that can be described as a Jewish Gentile Christian dialectic. Again, none of these people whom I'm giving you examples of are building their arguments based on what we might initially see as a biological view of race. They're talking about something that's far more complicated, that's more encompassing. For Bauer, it was very important for him that Jesus, who he recognized was a Jewish figure, a Jewish Messiah, was not actually embodying what Bauer saw as Jewish sensibilities, as Jewish spirit. For Bauer, interpreting Jesus's relations with other Jews was a way of discerning the Gentile nature of Jesus. So Jesus's biological ancestry might have been Jewish, he conceded, but Jesus's spirit, the essence of the gospel, was actually something that moved away from that, he argued, because, for example, Jesus rejected ritualism, whereas the Jews, those who were more Semitic in their constitution, could not embrace this more sophisticated level of existence. They were constrained to following traditional, legalistic, ritualistic understandings of Torah, of spiritual fulfillment. Jesus, in his view, represents a significant break from that. He's not inventing this idea. He's elevating it to another level that became very influential. Again, he's actually not concerned with bodies per se. This is something else. And it's very similar to the way Limpieza de Sangre operated, because if you converted to Christianity, that wasn't enough. Conversion to Christianity, which one might not initially think of as a race, required a type of purity for one to embody it, not physically so much as psychically, morally, ethically, emotionally, and politically. Can you be true to Christian principles and Christian princes? So with Bauer, this became a way of shaping the study of Christian scriptures to actually base it on anti-Semitism. There have been many studies of the so-called Aryan Jesus, this process of racializing Jesus in ways that elevated Jesus by claiming that although he might have been born of a Jewish mother, that if one understood his message and his sensibilities and his spirit and the spiritual mission and orientation, that it was actually a very Aryan type of sensibility. So this is analogous to the claim that Ernest Renan was making, that what was really important was how one's inner workings, one's inner nature and inner mind was actually operating. There are many examples of how Jesus became a symbol for example, the Ku Klux Klan in their anti-Semitism. How would a Jewish Messiah ever function as a symbol of white supremacism? Is because of this legacy and this history. A couple of more examples of this before I wrap up. And that is other individuals, Rudolf Bultmann, for example, Martin Heidegger, were part of this existentialist 20th century mode of interpreting religion, and particularly Christianity. Heidegger, who is known as a Nazi, was very influential in existentialist philosophy. And like Hegel, he was concerned with the interiority of human subjectivity. Can a person be open to living a life of freedom, or is one trapped in a legalistic, ritualistic, very, as he saw it, base and elemental form of consciousness and living? And for him, the Christian gospel was actually rooted in this type of interiority, because it was a way of turning someone toward freedom. But remember, in this tradition of interpreting Christianity and interpreting Judaism and interpreting scriptures, that meant turning away from a very racist understanding of Jewish subjectivity. Rudolf Bultmann, in a similar fashion, claimed that he claimed to be demythologizing Christianity. The essence of the Christian gospel was not a physical resurrection, was not miracles. He said those things were actually holdovers from a pre-scientific, pre-modern way of thinking. The real essence of Christianity and of its gospel was this interiority. It was this turn toward existential freedom that could not be inhabited or contained or advanced through Judaism. So all of these examples that I've given you are a very admittedly fast-paced but exemplary demonstration of the way a long history of racializing practices that were rooted in anti-Jewish racism and very much happening alongside, as we look at this history, with anti-Muslim racism and anti-Muslim governance. All of that history went far beyond this simple biological notion of race. It was very much exemplified in this institution of Limpieza de Sangre, again, which is this comprehensive way of thinking about constitution. So that by the time you get to a 21st century understanding of the nature of religion, whether it's in the FBI's, as Steve and I have written about, or whether it is in the politics of the Arab Spring, we continue with this notion of identifying a type of essence in a religious subjectivity that proceeds along racist grounds. And so following the coup against Egypt's democratically elected government, we had David Brooks, who writes in the New York Times, incompetence is built into the intellectual DNA of radical Islam. And we've seen that in Algeria, Iran, Palestine, and Egypt, real world practical ineptitude that leads to the implosion of the governing apparatus. Brooks wrote, it was actually better not to have a democratic government if democratic governments were actually going to include this Islamic type of thinking, or this Islamic type of essence. Anyone who thinks that religion is merely just something that people believe are not paying attention to how this has functioned over centuries. So again, let's go back to the Limpieza de Sangre system. And it was rooted in this understanding that despite their claims, despite their commitments, that Jews and Muslims simply could not be part of good governance. They could not be part of a body politic that was committed to the values, the orientations, the civilizational essences of a Christian society, because there was something inherent to that religious nature that functions in the way that many people think today of a race, but will think of it biologically. And what's happening here in the history I've shown you goes far beyond that. It's more encompassing. And Ellen, with David Theo Goldberg, his well articulated, highly engaged, we're looking at the relationship between modern states, histories of race and racism, and racial states has really engaged very nimbly and skillfully with the way race actually goes far beyond a merely biological notion. And that it is very much invested in this concern about who gets to belong to political communities. Remember, that's what Limpieza de Sangre was actually rooted in. It was rooted in this question: who can belong to our civilization? For the hour there was a Western Christian civilization of Western Christian rulers. Can Jews, even if they convert to the religion of a Christian state, can they be trusted? Can they actually embody the sensibilities, the mores of Christian governance and Christian living? Limpieza de Sangre said, absolutely not. If you suspect that someone has Jewish ancestry or Muslim ancestry, you need to test them out and find it and extirpate it. Otherwise, you will pollute your society with people who are not capable of belonging to that society. The history of Limpieza de Sangre continues to be mirrored, and we see its resonances in many ways, from claims more recently of Jews threatening to destroy the essence, the civilizational essence of the United States. So there's been an ongoing rise in anti-Semitic movements that have viewed Jews in the US as incapable of belonging or being a threat to its essential essence, not over biology per se, but it's really resonant with these ideological moves of Limpieza de Sangre. And Muslims, can they belong to a Western Christian society? Very recent developments in France, for example, which have advanced in its National Assembly an anti-separatist law that would require all Muslim imams to sign on to embracing the Republican values of being French, which are not required by any other religious community, are reflecting these same kinds of ideals. So let's go back to what I started with, and that's Samuel Huntington, when he claims that the real conflicts in global politics are going to happen between civilizations, not so much nation states. The reason why Samuel Huntington became so highly valued and in one sense was a darling of US officials, people who were in government, restructuring national security practices. He wrote his article, by the way, in 1993. It got published just a few months after the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. And among the operatives in that bombing were Muslims. And in 2001, following the 9/11 attacks, there was even greater interest in Huntington's claims because he identified Muslims and the Chinese, which he claims China is a civilization that pretends to be a state. It's a culture that is merely posing as a state. That these were actually going to be the real enemies and the real threats of the West. And he claims that this is not race. But I think that if we actually pay attention to the history of anti-Semitism and its connections with the anti-Muslim racism that was part of the history of Limpieza de Sangre, we have to appreciate the fact that racial systems have never been merely about what people might think of as biology. They have always been rooted in this political question: who gets to belong? Who has the right subjectivity? Who's capable of actually becoming pristine in their relationship to this society, to this civilization, which Huntington claimed was the highest level of commonality among any humans. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I would certainly welcome your comments and happy to answer questions.
Professor Johnson, thank you so much. That was such an illuminating presentation, and also a really disturbing one. One impression you leave me with is how intractable this problem of racism is once you point to the long history and to its embeddedness in older forms of Western Christianity. I have a few questions, and I know we have lots of questions from other listeners. I guess one of my first questions for you would be, how does the account that you gave us fit together with the large number of Christians in the world who aren't themselves white? Why the push to convert Indigenous Africans and Indigenous Americans, given the suspicion of people with non-Christian origins? Where does that fit into this story?
Yeah, that's a great question, because Christianity is a global religion. Of course, Christianity did not start in the West. Its origins are non-Western religions. It's actually very much became a global religion pretty early because of empires. And over time, it was many centuries before Christianity became synonymous with what we think of now as a Christian West or European Western Christianity. So yeah, it's certainly a global religion. So the one answer is that the system of Limpieza de Sangre was never a universal part of Christianity. So it's interesting to consider the Christian and Jewish communities that were part of the rest of the world. So that's most of them, was a big part of the population. In Islamic polities, for example, although not to romanticize Islamic polities, it's not like everybody was on an equal level and it was radical totalitarianism, but what became celebrated as a European value of toleration, not killing people because of their religious identity, was actually an influence of Islamic polities. Because if you were a Christian or a Jew living in Islamic polities, you might not have been on the same level civically as Muslims, but you weren't going to be put to death because you weren't a Muslim. It was just a very different understanding of how the society worked. And it was a much more complex one. So if you look at Christian traditions in those parts of the world, if you look at Eastern Orthodoxy, very different conception of what it means to have a Christian subjectivity, because it was not growing up and operating and expanding under these very violent anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish Christian societies. And to your point, you were talking about the rapid increase in growth of Christianity among Africans, for example, or in Latin America. So it is worth considering that you said these aren't white Christians, right? So how do you understand that? So one of the things I think we have to learn, or rather take seriously from the history of Limpieza de Sangre, although many scholars have pointed to its role in shaping racial subjectivity of whiteness, and it's very complex. I pointed earlier to Geraldine Hang's work. Is one of, I think, the really leading meticulous interpreters of that relationship and how these have emerged. The way that history developed was such that it was about being Christian. It was Christian subjectivity. So I'll go, I know there are other questions. Just a quick example. If you look at Brazil today, and compare the Christian nationalism, which targets Orisha devotion and candomblé, which is African-derived religion, with the efforts to either celebrate or shape a state as a Christian state, you will see a similar kind of racializing logic. Or if you look at India, Hindus versus Muslims, we can go around the world doing this. If you look at the early history of Liberia, you know, it was I've written and claimed that Liberia was actually a racial state that was rooted in Christian belonging that violently excluded indigenous peoples. You could say, well, they were all Black people. You could look at Rwanda and look at Hutus and Tutsis and say, well, they're all Black. I don't understand what's going on. How could this possibly be a history of genocide? So I think one of the ways that we have to understand this history is that race is not only or just white versus not white or others. And that's actually part of how I understand one of the main takeaways of Limpieza de Sangre.
Thank you. And you're right, we have a lot of other questions for you. So I'm going to turn things over to Ann Albert.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's really wonderful questions coming in. So I'm going to try to maybe group some of them a little bit. A few questions are connecting with the contemporary United States in various ways, or the history of the United States in various ways. One of them is asking very basically how Huntington's theories, in which cultural clashes generally fit racial outlines along the lines of national outlines, how do you deal with a multi-ethnic or multinational
this is great.
country
so,
or nation?
yeah, someone put into the chat, thank you, Steve. I was referring to Geraldine King. She's written The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages. So medieval scholars have actually, some of them have actually been trying to correct the misconception that Europe is the natural homeland of the white race in a very simplistic single way, in order to recognize that actually Europe has not been, it's been a multiracial society, it's been a complicated society, as most places have been. It's not actually true that Huntington's theories align with the boundaries of racial populations. It's just not true. You know, you look at South Asia, before you get the partitioning, you have lots of different populations that are there. The United States has, since it's been the United States, has always been multiracial. It's not like we just got diversity in the 1960s in the United States. It's been more about who gets to belong. And so one of the fallacies of Huntington's theory is that he actually is making a racial move. Even though he claims, oh, you know, in the 30s and 40s, race disappeared and ethnicity went away. What we're really dealing with is culture. But there are actually all kinds of people. Just, I mean, if you ever, people who, the fights that are going on in Europe right now about belonging are a symptom of this. And let's be honest, if you look at what's happening to Muslims in Europe, we can go back to the long history, and anti-Semitism is still going on in Europe. But the very overt, strident practices of violently killing people, of passing laws against their belonging, that was part of Europe. And it would be anachronistic to say, well, you know, we were all together in one in Europe until these Muslims just got here 25 years ago. That was not the case. The Christian Europeans did not identify racially as being the same people with Europe's Jews. So they don't overlap. The claim that you can take nations and civilizations and that they're basically one race per civilization is just counterfactual. You might have a majority population, but it's not a homogeneity.
So it just doesn't work as a model, really, for talking about the US.
No. And for most
and yet on the other hand, some of the things that arise as a part of this conversation definitely seem to inform beliefs of white supremacists and especially ethnic white nationalists in the US today. Do you want to talk about how those things connect at all?
Absolutely. So, you know, one way is that again, Steve and I have tried to raise attention to this in our book that we have, Beyond Religion, because of a lot of national security practices, institutions, claims, particularly since the 90s. People associate terrorism with Muslims. And we just had an insurrection in our nation's capital. There's an ongoing investigation now, and one of the problems that's being addressed is, well, what's the real threat of terrorism? Is it Muslims? Should we have a Muslim travel ban, which we had until very recently? Is it the Jews who are trying to take away the United States? Or actually, should we be looking for terrorism, regardless of who does it? And should we stop using terrorism as a racial or religious category? So one way that this connects is that we're actually seeing the unfortunate results, that the failure to even secure our nation's top leaders. You saw the Vice President of the United States running for his life in our nation's capital in January, because people felt like we're going to have a very large white nationalist rally. This is not a really significant threat to people's safety. And so I think that we are dealing with the consequences of that fallacy. It is certainly true that this Christian nationalism is very much a part of the arguments, the claims, the symbols of white Christian nationalist movements that would claim that that people who are not true Americans, and that's being defined along Christian nationalism, not only don't belong here, should not have certain rights, and are actually a threat. So it's worth observing as well that if we move beyond the white Christian nationalism, we have Christian nationalism. So you have Christians of many races who are part of this nationalist movement. And I think that needs to be a reminder to us that if we pay attention to the history of Limpieza de Sangre and to the history of anti-Muslim racism, anti-Jewish racism, one of the big takeaways is that we cannot think simplistically about race. We cannot think that race is just biology. We can't think, if we see Black and white and Latinx Christians getting together to claim that Jews and Muslims don't belong to the United States, we can't say, well, this can't possibly be racism, a form of racism, because you have different races of people who are part of the Christian nationalist movement. Well, who were the races of people who were part of Christendom, who were saying that Jews and Muslims were not part of it? To be Western has meant for centuries, it basically meant that you weren't a Christian or a Jew. That's what it meant. And it continues to function in that way, among other ways. So is this relevant to white Christian nationalism? Absolutely. Should we simply treat the category of whiteness and Christian nationalism as so that one easily collapses evenly and reductively onto the other? No. We've actually got to recognize, yeah, that's a form of racism, but we also have to be accountable to the larger, more complex history of racism.
Thank you. Yeah, so thinking about it in relation to this history really exposes some of the continuities, but also some of the ways in which internal inconsistencies have developed, which makes it confusing for people, right? So getting into the history a little bit, there are a bunch of questions about Limpieza de Sangre as part of the history of racism. And so I'll put a couple of those questions to you. One of them is really well put by one attendee named Rachel, who says, my understanding has been that Limpieza de Sangre is the bridge concept between pre or non-racial and racial ideology. So before that, there was something that might have looked a little bit like racial ideology or racist thinking, but not in so many words. It actually came later. And here we're looking at this sort of bridge, which is really typical of the way we think about the early modern period in general. So the question is, do you agree with this? Or does the broadness of it, as you've characterized it, mean that we actually need to date the emergence of racial thinking earlier than the Enlightenment?
Well, most people aren't going to agree with what I have to say, but that's okay. I mean, it's fine. That's why scholars study this, because it's not easy to understand. Yeah, it's not obvious. But no, I actually agree with Geraldine Hain that we need to have a much more sophisticated understanding of what race is. And there is a lot of investment in this idea that, well, it just got started X number of years ago, 2 centuries ago, 4 centuries ago. And I understand the attractiveness of that. If you can show that it's very recent, it helps to make the ethical critique against racism. But if the evidence is there to show that race is a political system that might make recourse to all kinds of things, hair texture, skin color, religion, language, clothing style, how people dance. If we recognize that history, because that's what we see with Limpieza de Sangre, then I think we have to recognize that Limpieza de Sangre is not merely the beginning of race, or is not the bridge that connects race to religion. It is a very important instance of something that I think there's a strong argument for has existed even earlier. And as I said, most people won't agree with that, and that's fine. There's actually a lecture happening at 3:30 Eastern Time at Virginia Tech that Geraldine Hing is giving about this, and then we're going to do a podcast with her. Lots of work on this. There's lots of room for discussion and debate, but that's how I understand it.
Yeah. So just following up on that a little bit, do you find the idea of castes helpful in thinking about this? So one attendee wrote or asked, when Limpieza de Sangre was used to create the taxonomy of castes in the Americas under Spanish colonial rule, race came into prominence over cultural distinctions. And I think there he's referring to the sort of broader, sense of this bodily constitution in connection with religion and other dimensions, right? So do you agree that that's the moment where that may have shifted, or does caste help to make some of these finer distinctions?
Yeah, so I think that one can read caste as a racial system. Now, I know there are multiple experts who argue, Orlando Patterson's one, for example. He's argued that we should not confuse race with caste, and he has a set of claims about why he thinks that's the case. But I think that there's more of a biological slant to how he understands race. And I think that we're trying to theorize race. That's why we're never all going to agree on exactly what it is. But I'm just trying to be, you asked me, I'm trying to be transparent about how I understand it. It's a political system, political community, who's in, who's out, who can be pristine in their relationship with that political community. And when we do that, we're doing race. And whether you justify it through language, through culture, behavior, sensibility, what you're made of in this holistic way, that's what we're doing. And you can find people all over the map who will say, no, if we're not talking about biology, we're not talking about race. And I don't see how you could sustain that if you look at the history of what we're calling race, because people like Hegel could care less about skin color. He's not really interested in that. He's interested in something else. But I think he's doing racism. I think that's exactly what he's doing. I think caste can certainly be read as part of a set of racial institutions, racial practices. I understand why people would disagree. And that's great. I invite more conversation and discussion. I'm not trying to be doctrinaire with it, and admit this is very complicated. That's why it needs careful study. But I would be careful of saying, okay, there was cultural difference first, and then race happened, because I think what people are assuming is that race is essentially biology, and the actual history of race is not always, but is often unconcerned with biology. Like Ernest Renan, he doesn't really care what kind of bodies Jews have. He wants to know who has the oldest language. And if you study language, this is why he created philology. You can map the workings of the soul of a race, because he's thinking like Huntington, that you got these populations of people, and they're basically the same. Once you get to their civilizational level, they're basically the same.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you've really traced the genealogy of these ideas highlights, really fronts the much broader meaning of the categories that they've had over time. So connected, we've had a few questions in another kind of zone, which I think follows up on the idea of caste in the sense of class. So people are asking about economics and money and what role they play in all of this. In particular, maybe one way of getting at that question is that scholars of early modern Nigeria have emphasized the extent to which the Inquisition and some persecution of converted Jews was related to wealth or perceptions of wealth. Mm-hmm. So, but in a more general sense, is there also an economic or class-based component of these broad categories?
Sure, there can be. So just to clarify a little bit, one of the theoretical claims that I have not stated explicitly is that I think that racialization is a process that racializes, that does the big project, who's in and who's out of the political community. And it does that by instantiating a certain set of fundamental meanings in different kinds of attributions. They can be religion, they can be skin color, it can be moral sensibilities, they can be class. Right? If we look at the history of eugenics, for example, so the United States created this eugenics movement, and we impacted the world in very destructive ways with it. A lot of that was rooted in claims like this. Well, people are born with a certain, here we go, constitution, right? that predisposes them to poverty. They might not have thrift. They might not have initiative, right? Well, that's not skin, it's not bone texture. Where do you find initiative in a body? If you take a cadaver and dissect it, where is the initiative located? Where is this sense of zeal or thrift? It's not a biological kind of thing. It goes back to the relationship between the Limpieza de Sangre and the soul. Like, what do these immaterial dispositions have to do with one another? So I think that class can be racialized. I don't think that class is always already race. I don't think religion is always already race. I don't think skin color is always already race. Because let's be honest, right? You have people who are racially classified as Black who have albinism. They actually lack the biological capacity to produce melanin, but they're still classified as Black. Right? You have people who are called racially classified as white of all kinds of skin colors and hair textures. And so I think we have to keep paying attention to the fact that while we can recognize certain clusters of attributions, I'm not claiming that there's no that biology plays no part in the construction of race. Of course it does. Other things that are not biological also play an important role in the construction of race. And so I think we have to ask this question, well, what's the project? What are we actually accomplishing when we're doing race? And I think if we ask that question, we can get towards some kind of theoretical framework for what race is. And so I think we have 30 seconds left. I'll stop talking there.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have time for another question, but I'll just say that that's really clarifying for me, and I find it really helpful. Thank you.
Professor Johnson, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for a really helpful, provocative, illuminating talk. We've learned so much. For all of those who are listening, a reminder that we're taking off next week. And when we come back in 2 weeks, it will be with the new unit exploring racial and cultural diversity within the Jewish world. So thank you, everyone. Be well. And thanks once again, Professor Johnson. Really wonderful. Wonderful to see you.
Great seeing you too, Mira. And thanks again for the invitation.